Hi, welcome back to La Belle Vie. So, Sarah Boone's battered spouse defense. What do we know thus far? Well, we know that she's going to pursue the defense. Mr. Bankowitz indicated that one, they were pursuing a battered spouse expert, and they were going to be having that expert testify not just to generally speaking, what is the syndrome, how does it apply, or responses to hypothetical questions, but actually going to present testimony of their expert of his or her examination of Sarah Boone and how that examination applies to the defense in her case. Now, as we also know, that opens the door to the state to have its own expert testify. So if that all winds up happening, that's going to be super interesting. But in the meantime, what do we know about Sarah and George's relationship and how that information can apply to the battered spouse defense? We know that both of the experts are going to bring in testimony about their history. So I thought it'd be interesting to dive a little deeper into what we know and use that based on a framework from one of the leading experts on the battered spouse defense. So before we get started, I thought it would be helpful to create a timeline of what we know about their DV history. So here we go. I'm inserting here the history that we know. So from publicly held information, we know that the first record of an arrest between the two for DV was on July 25th, 2018. In this instance, both Sarah and George were arrested. George was charged with battery, and Sarah was charged with strangulation. Now, there seemed to be some period here of calm. I don't know that that was necessarily true. We'll look for that in the testimony, but at least with respect to arrests, there was a span. And then the next incident was on June 15th, 2019. Here is an incident where George was arrested and he was charged with battery, and he was ordered to have no contact with Sarah. The problem with that was that 3 days later, George was arrested again because he violated his pretrial release conditions. Basically, he was over at Sarah's again. And so that was a violation of his pretrial release conditions. He was put back into jail. His bail was revoked. They ultimately, Sarah neglected to prosecute, and George was eventually released in July. Then in August 8th, George was ordered to pretrial diversion. So this is kind of like a second chance. But unfortunately, that didn't last long because on August 28th, 2019, George was arrested again. He allegedly punched her neck and pulled on her hair, so he was again arrested for battery. He was then again arrested on September 4th, 2019, for battery. Again, this was a minor injury to his ear. At this point, he was in jail. And eventually on October 18th, he was placed on probation. As part of his he pled no contest, and as part of that, he received a 62-day jail term, which he was credited for those 62 days for time served. He was also put on probation for 365 days. Unfortunately, that he died before that because 2/24/20 was the date of the incident. Okay. So there's the timeline. Now we'll go ahead and move forward to the analysis of Dr. Lenore Walker's battered spouse syndrome. Okay, so here's a nice overview of Dr. Lenore Walker. She's first the foremost authority on battered spouse syndrome. She refers to it as battered women syndrome, but neither here nor there. We're going to call it battered spouse syndrome because that's the way it's defined under Florida law. Her research prompted the New Jersey Supreme Court to recognize the defense in 1984, which was one of the first states to do so. She was also an expert testimony in one of Florida's leading Supreme Court cases on battered spouse syndrome, which was Weiland v. State, and she's testified in over 400 cases. Now, one of the things that she explains that the benefit of having a forensic psychologist understanding of the battered spouse syndrome is that the expert can help to explain self-defense and what happens during calm periods. And so this helps the jurors understand what a reasonable battered spouse is versus just a reasonable person. And so that's really super important in cases like this. She also provides testimony on the cumulative effects of the abuse to better help the jury understand the syndrome. And finally, what she can add as an expert testimony is what her approach is to present her 7 battered women's syndrome factors, which we'll go over shortly. And then she'll add the specifics of the evaluation of these 7 factors to the particular defendant. So here, Sarah Boone. And then she also recommends including family and childhood history. So if an expert that kind of followed the approach that Dr. Walker takes, we would also expect to get some of that background details. Okay, so what are the elements of battered spouse syndrome according to Dr. Walker? So first, what she explains in her research is that the battered spouse syndrome is really combining the 4 common elements of post-traumatic stress disorder and then adding 3 additional elements that are specific to battered spouse syndrome. So first, here she goes over real quickly the 4 elements of PTSD, which are re-experiencing trauma. And what she means by this is re-experiencing trauma in a variety of ways, including intrusive memories, nightmares, night terrors, daydreams, flashbacks, and physiological responses. The second factor of PTSD is hyperarousal of physical and mental symptoms. This includes anxiety reactions, crying, sleeping or eating problems, exaggerated startled responses, or other fearful responses. The third element of PTSD is avoidance symptoms. So things you'd expect to see would be numbing emotions in the form of depression, disassociation, denial, minimization of fear and harm, decreased activities and isolation from people. And then the fourth element of PTSD is cognitive disturbance and attention problems. So here you're going to be looking for things like negative alterations in mood and cognitions, such as an inability to remember traumatic events, negative self-esteem, difficulty experiencing positive emotions, disinterested in activities, and detachment. So those again are the first 4 elements of PTSD. And then according to Dr. Lenore's research, battered spouse syndrome adds 3 additional factors. So in order to show that a individual has this syndrome, you'd have to show the first 4 elements of PTSD plus these 3. So the first is disruption in interpersonal relationships. So things to look for here is being treated as the batterer here, the defendant, is shown to have been treated as a possession, controls access to the defendant's family or friends, or always has frequent telephone contact with them throughout the day, constant threats to leave, or just unpredictable behavior in general from the alleged harasser. We also have the second additional syndrome factor, which is physical health and somatic symptoms. So here you're looking for either actual physical conditions such as nausea, lack of appetite, pain, weakness, or dizziness, or you're going to see excessive worrying about these symptoms, worrying about nausea, worrying about weaknesses, dizziness, or an exaggerated response to these symptoms. So someone that has very exaggerated dizziness or exaggerated lack of appetite. And finally, the fourth or the seventh factor for battered spouse syndrome, according to Dr. Lenore, is sexual intimacy issues. And here it's broader, not just dealing with sex itself, but basically broader, looking to things like jealousy when talking with the opposite sex, or even spending time with other people, such as children, even being jealous of the alleged harasser being jealous of the time that the defendant spends with her kids or his kids. So in all of these things showing that they can lead to violence, and also control on sexual behaviors, when to have sexual contact or even withholding can be a controlling factor. So those are the 7 factors from Dr. Lenore's research on battered spouse syndrome. So what I thought it would be helpful here, again, is to go through these 7 factors and think about what we know thus far. We're going to go ahead and start first with the first factor, which is re-experiencing trauma. So for the first factor, re-experiencing trauma, besides the information we have from Sarah's interrogation/interview at the police department, where she said she hadn't been sleeping, we really don't have any information per se about her experiencing any kind of re-experiencing the trauma, or any information that she was experiencing nightmares or disturbing thoughts about any of the alleged beatings that she withstood from George. So I think for this one, we're probably going to look to the expert testimony to fill in those gaps. And so through her analysis of Sarah, I would expect to see some testimony here on this re-experiencing trauma in order to show that first element of PTSD. Okay, so hyperarousal of physical and mental symptoms. We definitely saw a lot of this in both the interviews that the police had on the scene, and her following the interviews/interrogation she had the following day with the detectives. So I'm going to insert here a couple of examples of this kind of hyper-aroused, physical, exaggerated response. So let's look at those right here.
I fell asleep.
When did you do CPR?
This morning, when I found him.
Before you called?
Yes!
It's 1 o'clock right now.
I was awake, but I actually got out of the bed at like 12:30ish, whatever. So I came downstairs, and I was like, oh, he's in the suitcase still. And that's when I found him, and I took him out, and I tried doing CPR, and then I called him, and then I called you guys.
Did he get here before the fire department got here?
Who?
Your husband? Or
Yes.
your ex-husband?
Yes.
Okay. Where does he live at?
Right down the street.
Okay. So you were playing, and who zipped him up in?
I did, but then I fell asleep.
Okay. You're okay. I wasn't here. I'm just trying to figure out what
I
happened.
fell asleep, so I don't know if he suffocated or like had an aneurysm or a heart attack or what.
What kind of medical conditions does he have?
None that I know of.
Nothing that you know of.
None
You
that I
didn't take
know
any
of.
medicine
No.
last night?
No.
No medicine.
All we had was a bottle of wine.
Know that.
You got up and you went up to bed.
Alcohol is a shitty thing. It's alcohol. Not, again, the reason that you killed him. You all,
Please sit down.
listen to me.
Please sit down.
You all, listen. I did not intentionally kill him.
So yeah, I think those are some pretty good examples. We also know from the detective's interview with the property manager that she described Sarah as being very handsy and almost inappropriately touching her, and it made her feel so uncomfortable that she kind of told her, back off, don't touch me. So I think that this one probably is not going to be difficult. We already see some of the elements of her behavior here, but I would expect to see additional testimony from her expert on this hyperarousal of physical and mental symptoms factor for PTSD. Okay, so for the third factor, PTSD is avoidance symptoms. So we have seen some showings of avoidance symptoms from Sarah's behavior. For example, her excessive alcohol use. That could be arguably as avoiding, kind of her situation, or maybe possibly avoiding the alleged abuse. They also seem to leave a pretty isolated life. I mean, Sarah's world seemed unfortunately quite small. She also indicated in the interview on the scene of the incident when the detectives were talking to her, and she mentioned that she had no family, that her parents had passed. I believe her one brother was out of the country and one brother was in prison. So it definitely seemed like she didn't have like a lot of family other than, her ex-husband, Brian Boone. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that in her interrogation video, where she kept talking about how much she was helping George, and that was really her goal, was to help him with his classes and working with his probation officer. And so I think that could be used against this factor, right? Because if she was so passionate about helping him, then why wasn't she also afraid of him? That those two don't necessarily make sense. So I'm interested to see how that may play out by the expert. But in any event, I think we also expect to see expert testimony, additional information that we don't know about as to avoidance symptoms. I would expect to see that from her expert as well. Okay, so the fourth factor of PTSD is cognitive disturbance and attention problems. So she did exhibit some lack of details and recalling details of traumatic events. But I think ironically, those seem to be fuzzy details about traumatic events where she was arguably, allegedly, the instigator. She seemed to have a lot of details when she was the one that was on the alleged receiving end of the traumatic actions. So I don't know about that. I assume this is also the one, remember, where there's, showing of negative self-esteem or negative feelings towards herself. I think we will assume that the expert is going to need to come in and talk more information about her background and her evaluation of his or her evaluation of Sarah as to that aspect of it, because my impression of Ms. Boone, and again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm just a layperson like all of us, right? I would say that at least from her interview, particularly her interrogation, as she came across quite the opposite, and not negative self-esteem at all, as she seemed quite rosy and high on herself. And I thought I would insert a little snippet here in case anyone wanted a reminder of kind of how Sarah sees herself on this. But I'm not so sure it's negative. Listen in.
You had a look on your face when she asked you if you've ever done that before. You looked kind of shocked. And
No.
Okay, but why did you say it like that? Like,
I don't think you all understand who I am.
okay. Well, tell me.
I mean, I've always been a straight-A student. I am an outstanding mother to my son.
Okay.
I excel at everything. I would not do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure when you say things like I excel in everything, that's going to go over really well on this particular element. But I don't know. What do you think? Okay, let's go now to the 3 additional factors for battered spouse syndrome. Okay, so the first of the 3 additional factors in order to show battered spouse syndrome, the first is disruption in interpersonal relationships. Now, I think we know a lot about their relationship in general. Both seem to have negative aspects towards each other. There's prior DV incidents by both Sarah and by George. So I think there's a lot there just on their history as a couple. The other thing is when Sarah described, this was at a time when they were separated, they weren't living together temporarily, and Sarah described George when he would ride his bike to work and he would pass behind her her apartment and kind of peep over the wall to look at her to and from work. And that is kind of one of the examples, right, is kind of a stalking type behavior. Now, again, this is, who knows if it's true, but that is the one type of thing that you would expect to see in this disruption in interpersonal relationships prong. In her interrogation, she said that she talked a lot about George not wanting her to give her space, and he always wanted to be together with her and wouldn't leave her alone. And she talked about she would go upstairs and read a book or take a walk, and and that is, again, that type of behavior that we would expect to see in that prong. But what was interesting is, not long thereafter in that interview, she admitted that she hadn't felt that way lately. She hadn't felt smothered, and that, the things were fine. They were going well. So again, contradictory statements. I think we're going to expect to see additional information and analysis from her expert on this prong. But that being said, I do think that there is enough there that I don't think it'll be difficult for our expert to establish this one. Okay, so the second additional prong in order to show battered spouse syndrome is physical health and somatic symptoms. Now, we don't really have a lot of information right now today about any kind of physical symptoms that Sarah was suffering. I think I mentioned she had been having some sleep issues, but that was presumably because of the murder. In some of her prior police reports, she had mentioned she'd been angry. But again, I think we're going to need more testimony from her expert to give us more details of whether she was suffering nausea or she had a lack of appetite from, the effects of her alleged domestic abuse. We also don't have any information on the other two elements of the somatic symptoms. We don't know. We don't have any information on her exaggerating symptoms or being excessively worried about these symptoms. So again, I think we're going to need to look to her expert's testimony and evaluation of Sarah to get some more information on this prong. Okay, finally, sexual intimacy issues. Here, I think there is information we have. I mentioned before jealousy being one. We do know that in two of her DV incidents that led to arrests with George, she did specifically state that the incident occurred as a result of them having a fight because she was talking to another man. So I think that there's some there, and I'm sure that the expert will probably talk some more about George's jealous behavior. Perhaps they'll bring in more information that we don't know. Any type of controlling behavior. I expect her expert to dive a bit deeper into their sexual dynamics. And so again, I think we know there's stuff there. I think we're just going to need to, listen, and it'd be interesting to hear what the expert has to say. Okay, guys, caution. Remember, there's two sides to every story. There's also two experts for every side. There's two experts, one for each side. So obviously, again, if Sarah's team does proceed with the battered spouse defense and they rely on that expert's analysis of Sarah specifically and how her state of mind applied to this syndrome, this defense, then the state is going to have the opportunity to have its own expert examine her. We know from the hearing, the recent hearing, that Mr. Bankowitz indicated that that would be the approach they would take. So again, we'll have to see what the state's expert says. But I came up with a list of things that I would want to see either the defense expert address or questions that are answered or things that I would hope that the state's expert would bring in. So let's go ahead, and these are just off the top of my head. And of course, as we learn more, I'll probably have more questions, but these are just some issues that came up the top of my head. So first, I think the expert's gonna really need to explain why she says they were having a good time. Why were they playing games? Why were they enjoying each other's company on that fateful night? Why did she describe everything as acting silly and so playful? Again, she said this multiple times during both the interviews on the scene and in her interview/interrogation. And so I think the expert is really going to need to explain, why did she keep adamantly saying that there was no signs of anything happening, they were having a good day? And I was thinking about this because that sounds crazy, right? Like, if you go with the battered spouse defense, you'd expect that they wouldn't be having a good time and that she wouldn't be having that kind of approach. And I was wondering if the expert would maybe come in and say that was maybe a coping tactic. If she was maybe sensing that something was brewing, and so therefore she kind of focused on the games, like art. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of something, because to me it seems super odd that adults would be playing hide and seek, and I'm just wondering if that's where the expert is going to go with that. Is this was some type of like way to kind of deflect and diffuse the situation, and so let's focus on art and games and something that's light. I don't know. What do you guys think? But that's something I'm going to want the defense experts to address. Okay, the suitcase video. I'm not going to play it on my channel. If I live stream the trial, which I plan on doing, and it comes up as evidence, obviously I will be live streaming the trial, but I'm not going to put the video on my channel. It's out there. You can, if you haven't seen it, you can go watch it. It's horrible. But in the video, the comments about what I was thinking about, like, how would that video play in with a battered spouse defense? And I was thinking, well, some of it could maybe be helpful for her. Like the things when she says, "For everything you've done to me, that's what you do when you choke me." I mean, that to me sounds more like someone that's trying to kind of defend themselves and is kind of in a state of fear, or of something kind of escalating. So as kind of bad as that sounds, it almost seems like that could be used as kind of showing that there was danger brewing. But then I think this can also be used exactly how it is being used by the state, as showing she had a depraved mind regardless of human life, which is the wording of the second-degree murder statute. I mean, and that comes in on the other parts of the video where she's using swear words. She's laughing at him. She's calling him stupid. I mean, just horrible, callous behavior. That's my name. Don't wear it out. Oh my God, how could I forget that one? And then also in that same interrogation video, Sarah implied that this was just the way they talked to each other. So I think that video could go both ways, but I was thinking of how could they use that video to their side? I think the defense is going to also have to address George's injuries. I don't know if it would be necessarily by the psychologists, but the defense is going to have to address the fact that George apparently had scratches on his back and neck, a cut lip, contusion on his left shoulder, bruising on his left forehead, and they described it like he had been hit on the head with something. And I think presumably everybody assumes it was the child's bat. So why isn't this just all more evidence of another example of her beating him up? So I think the defense is going to have to address that for sure. Another thing I thought was interesting, this was towards the end of the interrogation, before she was arrested. Sarah talked a lot about how the probation classes that he was taking really changed him. And she felt very good about that. And I think that could be used against her too, because it's like, well, if you felt comfortable that he was a changed man, then why were you triggered in this instance to kill him? If you're using a battered spouse defense, it's self-defense. You're admitting you did it. You did the thing. So if he was so changed, then why all of a sudden were you triggered? I think the fact that she has admitted to DV against George is going to definitely be used. And finally, I'm going to leave with, I think, a great part to end.
This is horrific, okay? Horrific. It is terrible.
Yeah,
horrific.
I don't think I'll ever be right because of this. Ever be right. Dealing with everything else that I have in my life, personally. And then this,
Okay.
whom I loved, it was not intentional. I will put my hand on the Bible. It was not intentional. I would not do that to him nor anyone else.
But you did.
Not intentional.
Chilling. I'm going to leave it there for today. Thanks again so much for joining. I really appreciate you watching. And as I mentioned, I'm really trying to grow this channel. So if you consider liking or subscribing or leaving a comment and let me know what you think. And in the meantime, I hope to see you in my next one, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.